Let's chat. What are we chatting about today?
The High Line. Previously in the episode about Hudson Yards, it was mentioned that the southernmost part of Hudson Yards would connect to the High Line. However, at that time, we didn't talk much about the High Line because I think it deserves an entire episode to discuss. What is the High Line? Simply put, it is a park that has been converted from an abandoned elevated railway. Even though this park has been completed for so many years, thinking about it now, the project is still quite astonishing. The entire High Line stretches 1.45 miles from north to south, approximately 2.3 kilometers. Most of the High Line is located within the West Chelsea neighborhood. The north side of this neighborhood connects to Hudson Yards. Thus, the northern end of the High Line ends at Hudson Yards. So today we will start from the south and head north, taking everyone through the High Line, and introduce what you will pass along the way. The southernmost point of the High Line begins at Gansevoort Street in an area called the Meatpacking District, a name that historically refers to the area's original role in meatpacking and processing. From the 1880s to the 1980s, Manhattan's meat products were brought here for slaughter, processing, and packaging. This also included many dairy products. However, with changes in food processing technology and the development of Manhattan's west side, this area has now evolved into a rather nice commercial district with many restaurants, clothing stores, and hotels, including an Apple store and Tesla showroom. The Meatpacking District itself has been designated as a historic preservation area. All demolitions, renovations, or alterations of historic buildings within the district require rigorous review and discussion by government agencies before proceeding. Thus, in this area, you can see many traces of the urban landscape's evolution, such as Samsung 837. On the west side at the southern end of the High Line, there is the Whitney Museum of American Art. The museum mainly exhibits American art. The building was designed by Renzo Piano, a light blue and light gray building.
Does it only house American artworks?
Yes, its collection and exhibitions mainly focus on works by American artists. This building was completed in 2015, so it's relatively new. It was chosen to be located here because of the popularity of the High Line. On the east side of the museum, there are several terraces and outdoor stairs facing the High Line, and you can see the Manhattan cityscape. If you come to this museum, I personally recommend walking up the stairs on the west side inside the museum because this staircase has large glass windows facing the Hudson River, and you can see several interesting buildings and installation arts along the riverbank. Walking north along the High Line, you'll first pass through a hotel called the Standard Hotel, and then on the west, you'll see a building with an odd shape called the Solar Carve, designed by Studio Gang. It is said that the building's unique shape is designed not to block the sun for the High Line. Whether you believe it or not, I do.
Were all these new projects built after the High Line was completed?
Yes, because this area used to be an industrial zone. The more modern buildings you see now were planned and built after the completion of the High Line. Continuing north, after crossing 15th Street, you will pass through Chelsea Market. The Chelsea Market building itself occupies a whole city block. Its east-west sides are between 9th and 10th Avenues, and north-south between 15th and 16th Streets. The entire building is composed of 19 independent structures joined together. Currently, the first floor of the building is a food court with an indoor street running east-west, connecting 9th and 10th Avenues. There are many restaurants and small shops on both sides of the Market Street. The second floor and above are currently offices. It is worth mentioning that the building of Chelsea Market, together with the building at 85 10th Avenue on the west side of 10th Avenue, were built by the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco, in the 1890s for their own use. You might not have heard of this company, but you must have eaten their biscuits. Want to guess which one?
Oreo.
Yeah, Oreo is made by them. So from the 1890s to the 1950s, Chelsea Market was Nabisco's baking factory and office. After the completion of the elevated railway, the raw materials for making biscuits were delivered directly to this bakery via the railway, but currently they no longer make biscuits here. As mentioned before, the offices above the second floor. Can you guess which industry the main offices above belong to now?
Tech companies?
Exactly. And Google is the biggest tenant. YouTube has many studios on the 5th floor. Google even spent $2.4 billion in 2018 to buy the entire Chelsea Market. Since we mentioned Google, we cannot fail to mention the block to the west of Chelsea Market, which is 111 8th Avenue on the west side of 9th Avenue. The building there occupies an area almost as large as Chelsea Market, but the number of floors is more than twice as many. This building was constructed in 1932 by the New York Port Authority to be used for storage and industrial facilities. Later, after 2000, Google became the biggest tenant, and finally, in 2010, Google simply bought the entire building for $1.8 billion. This has become Google's headquarters on the US East Coast.
Besides Google, are there other tech companies?
There are, because it has a clustering effect. So a large software and technology company's headquarters here will attract many other related technology industry companies to rent office spaces here. Returning to the High Line, if we continue north through Chelsea Market, after passing 17th Street on the west, you will see a pair of twisting towers, a development called One High Line, designed by Bjarke Ingels Group. I think the condition of this plot is excellent and quite rare because the High Line runs through the east side of this development, and the west side is the Hudson River, which is the first row of river views. This piece of land is probably the only one nearby that has both of these conditions, so the original developers paid a high price for this land. However, later during the pandemic, the developers themselves had financial difficulties, and the construction site was temporarily suspended. At that time, the building was about 70–80% complete. However, due to financial issues, this plot was later auctioned off by investors and sold to the current developers. This development project is expected to be completed in the second half of 2024, including residences for sale and a hotel. The residential part has already started selling. Continuing north, you will pass many works by Star Architects. The first one to mention is Lantern House, designed by Thomas Heatherwick. The geometric shape of each window looks a bit like a lantern. It was conceptually derived from the bay window. However, I think the special part of this project is that the High Line runs almost through the middle of this development, so it's the only place where both sides of the High Line belong to the same development. This development has a small tower on the west side of the High Line and a taller tower on the east side. The lobby of this residential project is underneath the High Line, connecting the two towers. Personally, I think it's a pity that the two towers facing the High Line don't seem to have any special design approaches to resonate with the park. Otherwise, I think the condition of the land itself is quite interesting.
Yeah, the lobby is cool under the High Line.
Additionally, on the west side of the same block is a headquarters building for a media company designed by Frank Gehry called the IAC building. Next door there's a small residential building designed by Shigeru Ban, and on the opposite side to the north is another residential building designed by the French architect Jean Nouvel called 111th Avenue. However, these buildings are not directly connected to the High Line, they are just very close. Continuing north after passing 21st Street, you will go by a dark blue arc-shaped office building at 512 West 22nd Street, designed by Cook Fox. The building itself has several terraces planted with a lot of vegetation to respond to the greenery of the High Line. Also, on the same block near the river on that side is a residential building designed by Norman Foster called 551 West 21st Street. After passing 23rd Street, you will see a residential building designed by Neil Denari called High Line 23 on the west side of the High Line. Finally, in this series of residential projects designed by Star Architects next to the High Line, one must mention 520 West 28th Street, designed by Zaha Hadid. This residential building was built from 2014 to 2017, and Zaha Hadid passed away in 2016, so this project became the only and last residential work of Zaha Hadid in New York. Returning to the High Line itself, when you reach 30th Street heading north, the High Line will connect to the first phase of Hudson Yards and extend westward towards the river, surrounding the south and west sides of Hudson Yards' second phase and finally circling to the north side of the second phase. From the elevated park, a gentle slope descends to the ground level, which is the northern end of the High Line. The future integration of this section of the High Line with the open spaces and buildings of Hudson Yards' second phase is actually quite anticipated. So from the beginning to now, what we have talked about is the High Line, which has been converted from an abandoned elevated railway, because the project itself was very successful after completion and has a high usage rate. Government planning departments have been inspired by it. In addition to converting an abandoned railway into a park, the government now plans to further build new connector bridges to extend this High Line and then finally connect more urban blocks. Because the High Line itself is an elevated pedestrian area, it is a better pedestrian space since it is basically separated from ground level traffic. So far, there are 2 extension plans, one of which has been completed. That is, at 30th Street, a new connector bridge extends eastward from the original High Line to connect with Hudson Yards and the West Manhattan Development Project to the east. This extended connector bridge cost $50 million and was designed by SOM. As for the other extension plan, it is still in the planning stage. Basically, it will continue to extend north from the current northern end of the High Line to the northern Javits Center. Then, after passing the Javits Center, it will cross the north-south highway and finally end at Pier 76 of Hudson River Park. Another point to add is that the High Line is actually located on the west side of Manhattan, very close to the Hudson River Park. The closest part is only 1 block away, and the farthest is 2 blocks away. Hudson River Park also has many noteworthy features, but I plan to talk about Hudson River Park someday in the future. Today we will skip it, but all we need to remember today is that the High Line is very close to Hudson River Park. The High Line is so popular partly because along the High Line you will see many interesting urban landscapes or urban buildings. On the other hand, it's also because the design of the High Line itself is done very well, from the selection of plants, the design of street furniture, the planning of outdoor spaces, and the arrangement of artworks in the park all are very exquisite. The main design team of the whole High Line includes the architects Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, and landscape architects James Corner Field Operations, and the Dutch garden designer Piet Adolf.
Isn't JCFO now called FO?
The firm was called JCFO when designing the High Line at that time. From these designs and arrangements, you can feel that this park ingeniously combines the history of the past industrial era with the natural landscape and recreational functions of a modern urban park. So next we are going to talk about the history of the High Line before it became a park. This way, maybe the next time we go to the High Line, we will have a different experience. To talk about the history of the High Line, we might need to start with the development of railroads in New York State 200 years ago. The earliest development of railroads in New York State began near Albany in 1826. Subsequently, a number of small railroad companies started to emerge throughout New York, each operating short sections of railway. Around the 1850s, these small railroad companies were consolidated into a large company called the New York Central Railroad Company. This company's rail network extended from Manhattan all the way north, connecting cities along the Great Lakes of North America, reaching as far as Chicago. These railroads were mainly used for freight transport rather than passenger transport. The goods, food, and commodities like coal that Manhattan needed were transported from the inland areas of the United States to downtown Manhattan via the New York Central Railroad's tracks. The railroad entered Manhattan from its northern end and then ran south along the Hudson River shoreline on Manhattan's west side all the way to the downtown area, mostly at ground level. However, this ground-level railroad caused significant safety issues in the more densely populated areas of Midtown and downtown Manhattan. At the time, traffic from cars, trains, horse-drawn carriages, and pedestrians were all mixed together. The freight piers along the Hudson River were very busy. Many east-west transportation routes from the piers to the interior intersected with the north-south railways. So, in the early 20th century, 10th Avenue and 11th Avenue, the roads that the railway traversed were nicknamed Death Avenue due to frequent traffic accidents. From the 1920s to the 1940s, in an effort to solve this safety issue, the railroad company even hired people to ride horses in front of the trains to warn pedestrians of the approaching train. These horse riders were known as West Side Cowboys because their role resembled that of cowboys in the American West driving cattle herds. Another point to mention is the shift in the broader U.S. context at the beginning of the 20th century. Both passenger and freight transport gradually moved from railroads to automobiles and trucks as the main mode of transportation, further encouraged by federal subsidies. Many interstate highways were built across the U.S., facilitating travel by cars and trucks. Against this backdrop, in 1929, New York City began what is known as the West Side Improvement Project. When mentioning the West Side Improvement Project, we must first talk about Robert Moses, who was essentially a political figure. The many plans he implemented during his tenure had a profound impact on New York's urban planning and architectural landscape. He essentially established the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, as well as the NYC Department of Parks and Recreation, becoming the first head of both agencies from the 1920s to the 1960s. Under the planning at that time, the West Side Improvement Project significantly changed the urban landscape of Manhattan's West Side in the 1930s. The main content of the project was the construction of a West Side elevated expressway running from the Upper West Side along the Hudson River shoreline all the way down to Battery Park at Manhattan's southern tip. We will talk about the details and impact of this West Side elevated highway later when we discuss Hudson River Park. This time we're addressing a sub-project within the West Side Improvement Project, which was the elevation of the West Side Ground Level Railroad, the precursor to the High Line. This plan was primarily to solve the traffic congestion and safety issues previously mentioned. In 1933, the West Side Elevated Railroad was completed and opened, running from Hudson Yards in the north to Hudson Square in the south. The entire length of the West Side Elevated Railroad was about twice that of the present High Line. The southern half of the elevated railroad was later demolished, leaving only the northern half, which is now known as the High Line. Originally, the ground level railroad was on 10th Avenue. When elevating the railroad, they chose not to build the elevated tracks directly above 10th Avenue, but parallel to it, on the west side of 10th Avenue. The elevated tracks would directly cross many city blocks, and at that time several existing buildings were demolished for it. The advantage was that the elevated railroad could directly pass through many factories and warehouses, so loading and unloading of goods would not affect the traffic on 10th Avenue. A classic example is that the trains on the elevated tracks could directly enter the Nabisco biscuit factory, now known as Chelsea Market. Another example of the West Side Elevated Railroad crossing a building is the Bell Laboratories building on Bank Street. You can still see remnants of where the railroad passed through this building, although the connecting tracks have been removed. Back in the day, the Bell Laboratories building was an important industrial research center in America, where many early telecommunications, television, and radio technologies were developed. Even during World War II, Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project used the Bell Laboratories building as one of its bases. However, Bell Laboratories stopped using the building after the 1960s, and in 1970, architect Richard Meyer transformed it into Westbeth Artist Housing, an artist's residence providing living spaces, art galleries, and theater performance areas for middle to low-income artists. This is considered a classic New York example of the reuse of an old building. In addition, the West Side Elevated Railroad project, completed in 1933, included the construction of St. John's Terminal, located in the Hudson Square neighborhood. As the name implies, this railway terminal building was at the very southern end of the entire West Side Elevated Railroad. The terminal building once occupied 3 huge city blocks, but now 1/3 of the building has been demolished and is under construction for a new residential building. The remaining 2/3 has been converted into new office space designed by Cookfox. In 2021, Google bought the entire building for office space. When we have the chance, we can talk more about the urban development of the entire Hudson Square neighborhood. The peak period of usage for the entire West Side Elevated Railroad was from the 1930s to the 1960s, transporting many products, meat, and milk to Manhattan every day. However, starting from the 1950s in the US, truck freight gradually replaced railroad freight as the country's infrastructure resources were almost entirely invested in building interstate highways, crowding out the development of railway transportation. Thus, the West Side Elevated Railroad also declined and was partially demolished and abandoned in the 1960s, including the St. John's Railway Terminal. After the 1980s, the remaining northern half of the railroad was abandoned and no longer in use. After abandonment, the remaining elevated tracks faced the fate of being demolished. But, as we all know, that segment of the elevated railroad later became the present-day High Line. So next, we'll talk about the story of how this railroad, which was originally to be demolished, turned into a park. From the 1980s to the 1990s, there were various proposals on how to handle the remaining elevated railroad. Towards the end of his term, the then mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, signed his final order, which was to demolish this elevated railroad. However, 2 locals, Joshua David and Robert Hammond, saw potential in this structure. By this time, the elevated railroad had been abandoned for almost 20 years. Most people saw it as a rusty and unsightly piece of industrial decay. Yet, these 2 saw the potential for repurposing repurposing the High Line. So in 1999, they founded the nonprofit organization Friends of the High Line, aimed at preserving and repurposing this elevated structure. In 2000, the owner of the elevated railroad, CSX Transportation, allowed photographer Joel Sternfeld to spend a year documenting the High Line across all 4 seasons. After a year, his photo exhibition, Walking the High Line, was the public's first glimpse at the vibrant, natural life that had overtaken the abandoned structure, sparking even greater imagination about the High Line's potential. Leveraging the high level of public discourse, Friends of the High Line and several celebrities held fundraising dinners over the next couple of years to raise money for the movement to preserve and repurpose the High Line. Among these celebrities, notable are the couple Diane von Furstenberg and Barry Diller. Diane von Furstenberg is a Belgian fashion designer. Her surname comes from her first husband, Prince Egon von Furstenberg, who belonged to a German royal family. Later, Diane moved the headquarters of her fashion brand to the meatpacking district right next to the High Line in 1997. She married her second husband, Barry Diller, in 2001. Diller had been the CEO of Paramount Pictures and 20th Century Fox, later founded Fox Broadcasting Company, and is currently the chairman of IAC. The headquarters of the IAC Media Group, designed by Frank Gehry, is located near the High Line. This couple later became the primary donors for the Little Island Project, which we can discuss more deeply when we talk about Hudson River Park. The background of these figures is highlighted to illustrate that the Friends of the High Line had significant support from celebrities, in addition to public attention. So in 2003, taking advantage of this momentum, Friends of the High Line organized a design competition that attracted over 700 proposals from around the world. Some of these proposals were very imaginative, like transforming the entire elevated railroad into a long swimming pool or building a roller coaster on top of the rails to create an amusement park. These proposals were exhibited in July of the same year in the main concourse of Grand Central Terminal. In September of the same year, Mayor Michael Bloomberg unveiled the preliminary plan for the High Line. A year later, in 2004, the New York City government decided to invest $50 million in the High Line, which, through fundraising, gathered an additional $150 million. Also in 2004, Friends of the High Line and the New York City government collaborated to host a design competition to select the design team for the High Line. The concept competition in 2003 sought ideas, whereas the design competition in 2004 was to select a design team. The winning design team included architects Diller Scofidio and Renfro, landscape architects James Cornerfield Operations, and Dutch garden designer Piet Adolf. The other 3 teams that made it to the final round were Stephen Hall Architects with Hargreaves Associates and HNTB, Zaha Hadid Architects with Balmori Associates, SOM, and Studio MDA, and Michael van Valkenburg Associates with DRT, Studio, and BBB. These teams were very well known, and Michael van Valkenburg Associates later designed Brooklyn Bridge Park, which we may discuss in the future. Then, in 2005, the railroad company that owned the elevated railroad transferred ownership to the New York City government. The transformation of the High Line began construction in 2006 and was completed in stages and opened to the public. The southern section opened in 2009, the middle section in 2011, and the western half of the northern section in 2014. In 2019, the eastern half of the northern end was also completed. Last year, 2023, the extension from the eastern half of the northern section to the connector bridge of the West Manhattan Development Project was completed and opened. This section was designed by SOM and JCFO. The entire design concept of the High Line was likely inspired by Joel Sternfeld's photos, which showed the robust natural development on the abandoned structure without human intervention. The beauty of these ruins and the biodiversity that nature developed were the elements the design team sought to interpret through their design. This concept was further transformed along the elevated railroad into each small urban microclimate. Some sections are sun-drenched, others are shaded. Some are dry, others wet. Some are windy, and some are sheltered. The design team catered to various urban microclimates. As a result, walking from one end of the High Line to the other offers a very diverse spatial experience. The paving, for example, changes from 100% hard surface to 100% vegetation cover, with the proportion and types of plants gradually changing according to the urban microclimate and public space arrangements. The interface between the hard pavement and vegetation is designed to present a dynamic process of ebb and flow. At Gansevoort Street, you can ascend the stairs to the High Line.
Did they have any special ideas when designing this entrance initially?
The architects intentionally designed the steps to be lower, so as you walk from the ground to the High Line, you would slow down and transition into the space surrounded by nature. After ascending to the High Line, you pass through a small grove that provides both windbreak and shade. Further north, before passing Chelsea Market, a section of the High Line comes very close to the riverbank with unobstructed views of the riverside. Here, loungers are placed for sunbathing and river gazing in summer, with water features that children especially enjoy walking on barefoot. It's also charming when covered with snow in winter. Continuing north near 17th Street, the High Line crosses from the east side of 10th Avenue to the west. There is an outdoor plaza with seat steps above 10th Avenue. Here you can sit and watch the traffic below or enjoy outdoor performances. From the ground, activities on the step plaza can also be seen through the glass. Between 25th and 27th Streets, the pedestrian walkway gradually rises about 8 feet, approximately 2 meters, allowing closer proximity to the tree canopies and enabling more shade-tolerant plants to grow beneath the walkway. The raised walkway features a framed lookout platform over 26th Street, offering a view of the street scene. Looking back at the framed scene from the street resembles the advertising billboards common on New York streets, except that the advertisements are the plant life and people on the High Line. Heading north to 30th Street, near Hudson Yards, there's a sunken space on the west side that allows you to see and touch the original structure of the elevated railroad up close. For safety, these structures have been specially treated on the surface and corners so that children can safely play there. Continuing westward, there are places to watch the sunset, and if you head east on 30th Street, the High Line once again crosses 10th Avenue. The High Line above this intersection is an open art square with a large piece of art in the middle that is usually large enough to be seen from the ground and is changed periodically. The art pieces throughout the High Line are curated annually by the Friends of the High Line team, which invites artists to create works for the park. Past the art square to the east is last year's newly completed bridge connecting the West Manhattan Development Project. The bridge is also filled with vegetation, and a segment of the bridge is made with a wooden truss structure. Although truss structures are common, using wood is a rare choice that gives a warmer atmosphere to the urban space, which I quite like. Lastly, we should mention the plantings designed by Pete Adolf. I've come to realize that his gardens are quite recognizable at a glance because they look particularly beautiful. He arranges the plants to give the visuals rich layers and colors, with each plant swaying differently in the wind and emitting distinctive scents. The landscape he designed offers a different appearance throughout the seasons, with each type of plant having its moment to shine over the year. Pete Adolf is probably the most romantic when it comes to planting flowers and grasses. Maintaining such a landscape, of course, depends on the regular maintenance by the team. The High Line is not maintained by the NYC Department of Parks and Recreation like other parks in New York, though it is under their jurisdiction. The actual operation and maintenance are carried out by Friends of the High Line, and the majority of the funds are obtained through fundraising. Simply put, they raise a substantial amount of money every year to maintain such a high-standard urban park. Every spring, the team at Friends of the High Line also calls on many volunteers to help with weeding so that the plants grow better during the spring and summer. With the opening of the High Line and its transformation into a popular Manhattan attraction, the urban development of the Chelsea neighborhood began to undergo significant changes. In the early last century, this area was actually full of factories and warehouses, but as rail transport declined, the community actually attracted many artists and members of the LGBTQ community. This was partly due to cheap rents, and on the other hand, the spaces of warehouses and factories were large and suited for art creation and display. From historical experience, we can observe that when a community gathers a lot of artists, it becomes increasingly fashionable and avant-garde. This leads to the development of cool restaurants and bars, gradually attracting gallery operators to provide exhibition spaces for artists nearby. Then, as a community becomes cool, it attracts more affluent people who want to live in the neighborhood, leading to the development of higher-end housing and entertainment activities, ultimately driving up property prices in the area, and ironically, displacing the initial groups who moved in, namely the artists. This cycle actually first occurred in the Soho area, and when the rents in Soho became too high for young artists to afford, they subsequently moved to the West Chelsea neighborhood. The opening and success of the High Line invisibly accelerated this cycle. Over the past few decades, we have seen West Chelsea develop into an art hub of New York and even the world. However, in the past 10 years, we have also seen the construction of many expensive residences in the community. From a macro perspective, I personally welcome such urban development. As an urban community becomes more refined, it is natural for housing prices to rise. Of course, from a micro perspective, there is much to be discussed regarding social justice and balanced urban development. On the other hand, I'm also quite curious about where the next Soho or West Chelsea in New York will be. We can have a session to talk about this if we have the chance.
But for now, West Chelsea still has many art galleries.
You see, there are already artists and even galleries choosing not to renew their leases, moving to other places. Current West Chelsea is already considered developed, and hence its rents are quite high. Besides the High Line, it's also close to the riverside, and is now a high-end residential area by the riverbank. It used to be an industrial area, and is very expensive now.
So where do you anticipate the next area where artists will gather?